It was a night that should have remained ordinary. October 1892. The moon hung low over a forested ridge outside Silver Creek, Pennsylvania, casting a pallid light over the valley below. The air smelled of wet leaves and smoke from distant chimneys, a comforting scent to most, but that night it carried a warning no one heard. 13 men arrived at a mansion perched on the hillside. They had been invited to a dinner, anonymous at first, a promise of fine food, rare wine, and business opportunity whispered to their ears by someone they trusted or thought they did. Each guest carried his own ambitions, his own secrets, unaware that those secrets would be the final currency they would ever exchange. The mansion itself was old, built from stone quarried decades earlier, its windows shuttered, its walls lined with the scent of decayed wood and dust that had settled over generations. Inside, the air was warmer, tinged with the aroma of roasting meat. The host, a man known only as Mr. Caldwell, appeared with the grace of someone who had lived 100 lives. His smile was polite, his bow practiced. But his eyes, those eyes saw far more than they revealed. They were led to the dining room, a long table stretching from one end of the room to the other, 13 chairs, polished silver, crystal glasses that caught the candlelight like trapped stars. The men laughed, nervously at first, exchanging stories of fortune and loss. The first course arrived, a delicate stew, rich, fragrant, and impossible to resist. No one noticed the subtle shift. The laughter grew uneasy, voices dropped, and the shadows behind the windows deepened, thickening as if the darkness itself had entered the room to observe. The fire crackled, but it was not warmth they felt. It was attention. Something alive, patient, and hungry. By the time the second course was served, there was an undercurrent. The men began to glance at one another with suspicion, unease crawling beneath their skins. A glass trembled in one hand, a fork clattered to the floor, and somewhere, beyond the walls of that mansion, the forest whispered. No one would leave that table alive. Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. The mansion had a name once, though it was long forgotten. Locals simply called it the House of Whispers, because even in daylight the wind seemed to carry voices that were not there. Windows rattled without reason, doors creaked when no one passed, and the path leading up to it twisted unnaturally, as if the forest itself wanted to hide what lay at its center. It was 1892, a time when Pennsylvania was alive with industry, the smoke of ironworks and mills drifting over the valleys, blending with the scent of autumn leaves. Men of business, adventurers and wanderers all moved through towns like ants, chasing wealth, opportunity, or the thrill of forbidden knowledge. And on that ridge, 13 such men would cross paths with something they could never understand. The servants in Caldwell's household were few, all silent, all unseen. They moved like shadows, appearing only to replenish wine, serve dishes, and then vanish into corridors lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow intruders. Some said the portraits were of previous owners, but others whispered that the faces were those who had once dined there and never left. Caldwell himself was a man of uncanny charm. He spoke of markets, mines, and fortunes, weaving tales that drew his guests closer, as if by gravity. Yet beneath the polite gestures, there was a precision to his actions, a meticulousness that hinted at something far darker. A hand lingered too long on a shoulder, a glass refilled without asking. The candlelight seemed to be, and toward him. As the men settled, the room felt alive, not the warmth of hearth or candle, but attention. They were being observed, measured, tested, each bite they took, each word they spoke, each heartbeat, noted. And yet, none realized that the first course, the savory stew, was more than nourishment. It was an offering. And once taken, it began a slow, irreversible process that would seal their fates. By midnight, shadows clung to corners, walls seemed to stretch, and the forest outside hushed itself, waiting. A storm was coming, but it was not the wind nor rain that would claim them. And if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. 13 men, 13 lives, each carrying ambitions, fears, and sins they thought hidden from the world. They came from towns spread across Pennsylvania, some from coal mines, others from steel mills, a few from distant cities where fortunes were made and lost in a whisper. Each one believed he was clever, untouchable, above the ordinary men who walked the streets below. There was James Harrow, a banker with trembling hands and a ledger full of illicit accounts. Henry Mallory, a lawyer whose tongue had silenced witnesses more than once. William Price, a miner who had struck gold in secret veins but had sworn no one would ever know. And others, equally ambitious, equally blind to the danger that awaited. Caldwell welcomed each with a smile that never faltered. He listened to their boasts, their jokes, their stories of conquest. And yet, as he nodded, as he poured wine and passed plates, something unseen crawled through the room. It whispered into the edges of minds, exposing truths they had fought to conceal. It was not just Caldwell who orchestrated this night. The house itself was a collaborator. Every floorboard groaned under invisible weight, every shadow stretched unnaturally. Every flicker of candlelight seemed to illuminate sins no man had admitted, even to himself. And through it all, the air grew thick with anticipation, as if some ancient entity had been waiting, patient and meticulous, for this very gathering. The guests laughed at first, polite chuckles that faltered when a shadow flicked past a doorway, or when a chair scraped the floor without cause. One man, Edward Linton, swore he felt a cold finger trace the nape of his neck. Another, Thomas Grady, insisted he heard soft murmurs, indistinct but unmistakably words. "They will join us soon." Secrets hung heavier than the silver chandeliers. Caldwell seemed to know them all, though he said nothing. His eyes lingered just a second too long, noting the twitch of a finger, the slight hesitation of a smile, the quickened heartbeat behind a steady facade. And when the first course was served, the stew thick and fragrant, it was clear that this was no ordinary dinner. Each bite carried weight, each sip of wine carried consequence. Each man unknowingly acknowledged the invisible ledger that Caldwell had already begun writing, their names, their sins, their final moments. By the time the candles burned low, an unspoken dread had settled over the table. The house breathed with them, the shadows leaned closer, and the night stretched thin, waiting for the moment when laughter would turn to screams. As the first course dwindled, the guests felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, so slight that only the most attentive would have noticed. The fire crackled with a hollow tone, a resonance that made the walls hum softly, vibrating through their bones. The shadows around the room began to lengthen unnaturally, stretching toward the table as though reaching for something beyond the flesh of the men who sat there. James Harrow noticed it first. A whisper, soft and indistinct, coming from the far corner of the dining room. He froze, listening, certain he had imagined it. But then it came again, a syllable, a sigh, a voice carrying words he did not understand, yet somehow recognized in the marrow of his soul. He glanced at Caldwell, whose smile remained serene, untouched by whatever horror had just begun. And as the first scream began to tremble in the silence, it was clear the midnight supper had begun. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A subtle twitch in James Harrow's hand as he lifted his glass, a sudden pallor spreading across his face. The others were distracted, caught in their own terror, unaware that the first sacrifice had already begun. Harrow's lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes widened as something invisible pressed against his throat, constricting, tightening, suffocating. He tried to speak, to call for help, but only a gurgle escaped. The silverware clattered to the floor. Caldwell's eyes never left him. A slight smile touched the corners of his mouth, but his calm was lethal. He watched as one might observe an experiment, noting every micro-expression, every flash of panic. Then the shadows in the corners shifted. They crawled across the walls like living things, black tendrils snaking toward Harrow. A low hum filled the room, vibrating through the floor, the table, the very air they breathed. It was a sound that seemed to come from inside their heads, pressing thoughts of fear, guilt, and regret into their minds. Harrow gasped once, twice, and then fell forward onto the table, his face pale, eyes wide and unseeing. The room seemed to breathe around him, absorbing his terror. A faint, acrid smell rose, but none dared move. The others understood instantly. They were next. The meal had begun, and the mansion was hungry. Henry Mallory, trembling now, tried to rise, to intervene, but when he reached for Harrow, a force invisible yet unyielding held him in place. The shadows recoiled from Caldwell's hand and surged toward Mallory, who screamed as his own hands betrayed him, gripping the table until his knuckles bled. The firelight danced across the walls, casting monstrous shapes over their faces. The first course had been an initiation, a tea est. Now, the real consumption began. Harrow's body was removed silently, as though it had never existed, leaving only a chilling silence that pressed in on the remaining men. Each understood instinctively that the mansion had marked them, that Caldwell was not merely a host but a gatekeeper, orchestrating a ritual older than law, morality, or reason. Fear became tangible, settling in their stomachs, wrapping tight around their chests. Each breath was stolen by anticipation. Every shadow could conceal a predator, and the realization hit them all at once. No one in this house would leave alive. The midnight supper was no longer a meal. It was an execution, and they had been chosen to be consumed. The second course arrived with deliberate elegance, as if the horror had yet to touch the table. Plates of roasted venison, rich sauces, and baked vegetables were set before each guest. The aroma was intoxicating, almost hypnotic, and for a brief moment, the men clung to normalcy, forcing themselves to eat. But the mansion had other intentions. The food carried a weight far beyond nourishment. Every bite seemed to anchor them deeper into the house's grip, every sip of wine a slow tether wrapping around their consciousness. Their senses sharpened unnaturally, aware of every shadow, every subtle movement in the corners of the room. The firelight flickered, revealing shapes that were not quite human, figures that crouched just beyond perception. Thomas Grady noticed first the sound of whispers threading through the air, rising from the walls themselves. They spoke in tongues unfamiliar yet intimately known. The syllables pressed against his skull, nudging at memories he didn't know he had. A shiver raced down his spine as he realized the house was speaking to them, shaping them, marking them. Caldwell moved among them with uncanny calm, pouring wine into glasses, refilling Platt's observing reactions with the precision of a surgeon. His smile remained unchanged, but it no longer carried warmth. It was a mask of authority, a herald of the ritual that unfolded with deliberate cruelty. The guests began to notice something else, subtle changes in one another. Eyes flickered with shadows that didn't belong. A hand trembled where it hadn't before. Breath quickened involuntarily. The mansion had begun its work, not merely consuming bodies but probing minds, exposing weaknesses, magnifying fears, and turning them inward. Edward Linton's gaze fell upon the mirror at the end of the room, and what he saw made him gasp. His reflection was wrong, slightly twisted. His eyes, larger, darker, hollowed. The mirror did not reflect the present. It reflected the inevitable. The hum from the walls intensified, a resonance that shook the table, vibrating through bone and flesh. The guests tried to stand, to flee, to confront Caldwell, but the air thickened, invisible forces pressing down, holding them in place. Panic surged, a tidal wave that threatened to drown reason. They realized with a sickening certainty that the supper was not merely a meal, it was a ceremony. Each course a step toward their doom, each bite a chain. And every moment that passed drew them closer to the final act, a climax designed to leave 13 men and nothing more. By the time the third course was served, terror had seeped into every corner of the room, silent but heavy, like fog settling on stone. The mansion no longer felt like a home. It was a predator with eyes in the walls and hunger in its breath. Every shadow moved, shifted, lurked with intent. Edward Linton had tried to speak, to call out to the others, to confront Caldwell, but words died in his throat. The mansion's influence had thickened the air around him, a pressure that stole courage and warped thought. He reached for his glass and froze. The liquid rippled unnaturally as if alive, black tendrils rising and curling toward him. The first tremor of movement across the floor caught Thomas Grady's attention. Without warning, Edward's body convulsed violently. His limbs jerked as though gripped by invisible hands. A strangled scream tore from his throat, echoing against the walls and bouncing back with distortion. Caldwell observed silently, his hand resting lightly on the table, the faintest smile playing at the corner of his lips. The room itself seemed to respond. Candles guttered and flared, shadows danced like devils freed from chains, the air thick with the metallic scent of fear. The remaining guests froze, instinctively understanding the inevitability of what had begun. Harrow was gone. Mallory and Grady felt the same invisible grip that had seized Linton. The mansion had chosen, and the body it took first was only the beginning. Edward's final scream was cut short. The sound folded into the walls, swallowed by the mansion, leaving an unnatural silence that pressed upon the remaining men. They could feel it in their bones, an understanding too deep for words. Survival was not an option. Each course served was a step toward the same end. Caldwell's voice, calm and commanding, cut through the room. Do not resist. To resist is to quicken the inevitable. To understand is to accept your place. The guests' eyes met one another, wide with horror, reflecting the same realization. They were not merely being fed, they were being prepared, conditioned and measured. The house had begun a systematic culling, and Caldwell was both conductor and observer. The air grew denser, suffocating as if the walls themselves were pressing inward. Shadows leaned closer. The fire sputtered, casting grotesque images across the faces of the living. One by one, they would follow Edward into the void. And with each passing moment, the midnight supper edged closer to its conclusion, the final course waiting, and the 13G raves silently promised. By the time the fourth course was set before them, the room had shifted entirely. The warmth of the candles no longer comforted. It revealed. Every flicker highlighted the taut fear etched into their faces, every shadow stretching like a predator ready to strike. The air was heavy, a choking mixture of fear, incense, and something more, something metallic, bitter, unidentifiable. The remaining men tried to move, to whisper, to find a plan, but the mansion refused their pleas. Doors resisted their hands, windows reflected only darkness. The walls pulsed softly, like a living thing, each pulse pressing deeper into their nerves, reminding them that they were trapped, and that the house, the host, and the ritual were all one. The fourth course was different. Rich game, sauces thickened with unknown spices, bread baked to golden perfection, yet each bite carried an unnatural heaviness. The first swallow of wine had been a mild tether. This meal was a chain around their minds, pulling thoughts into shadows, bending reason, amplifying guilt and terror until it was unbearable. William Price felt it first, a creeping nausea that clawed at his stomach, rising in waves that no ordinary sickness could explain. His vision blurred, and he saw the faces of the men who had already fallen, twisted in silent screams, staring at him from the shadows that now lurked in corners and reflected in mirrors. Thomas Grady realized the whispers had grown louder, words not his own forming in his mind. You cannot leave. You cannot resist. You belong to the table. He tried to shake them free, tried to move, but found himself frozen as if invisible chains held him in place. Caldwell moved among them, his calm authority unbroken. He refilled glasses, served plates, observed reactions. His smile carried a deadly patience, the certainty of one who had done this countless times before. The mansion echoed his control, every creak of floorboard, every sigh of the wind synchronized with his will. Desperation set in. The remaining men exchanged terrified glances, realizing that whatever force had claimed Edward and the others was intelligent, precise, and unrelenting. Their own fear became a weapon against them, fueling the mansion, feeding Caldwell, binding them tighter with every heartbeat. The fourth course marked the point of no return. They were no longer guests. They were participants in a design far older, far darker than ambition or greed could comprehend. And as the first man collapsed again, writhing silently in the shadows, it was clear the midnight supper would consume all. By the time the fourth course had been partially consumed, the mansion revealed its true nature. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting subtly, suffocating and enclosing at once. Shadows no longer clung to corners. They moved with intent, stretching across the floor like living fingers, brushing against the trembling men. William Price, still clutching his stomach, noticed something even more disturbing. The portraits lining the walls, which had once depicted stern ancestors and long-dead families, now seemed to shift, faces twisted into grimaces of terror, eyes wide, mouths frozen in silent screams, each mirroring the suffering of the fallen guests. He recoiled, realizing that the house itself was a gallery of victims, a record of each who had come to the midnight supper and never left. The whispers returned, louder, more insistent. Not from the walls this time, but from within their minds. Thoughts that were not theirs surfaced, secrets they had buried, misdeeds no one could know. James Harrow's mind screamed with memories of embezzlement, of lies told to protect a reputation, each memory magnified, distorted, and laid bare before the others. The mansion fed on these confessions, converting them into fear, each one a step closer to final surrender. Caldwell observed, silently, walking between the guests, his movements slow and deliberate, almost ceremonial. His calm presence contrasted sharply with the chaos of the room, a predator among panicked prey. "Do you see?" he murmured softly, almost to himself. "This house, this night, it reveals the truth in every man. And truth, my friends, is inescapable." Thomas Grady's gaze fell upon the shadows at the far end of the room. They seemed to ripple, forming shapes that hinted at the fates awaiting them. He tried to speak, to warn the others, but no words came. The mansion had claimed his voice, silencing him, leaving only the echo of dread. The remaining guests realized the horrifying calculus. Each secret, each hidden sin had drawn them closer to this fate. Their ambitions, their pride, their greed, they had led them here to a table where the price of indulgence was final, absolute, and irreversible. As Caldwell poured the wine for the next toast, the mansion seemed to pulse in anticipation. Shadows writhed in response, tendrils reaching toward the remaining men. And in that moment, one truth became undeniable. The midnight supper was no mere dinner. It was an unveiling, a trial, and a death sentence, all bound into a single, unholy ceremony. The fifth course had barely begun when the mansion struck again. William Price's convulsions escalated, his body twisting against invisible restraints, as if the very walls themselves were bending him into submission. His screams echoed against the high ceilings, but the sound seemed absorbed before it could reach anyone outside the room, leaving only a suffocating silence behind. The other men sat frozen, their eyes wide, witnessing the horror but unable to intervene. Fear had rendered their limbs useless, their voices trapped behind a barrier they could not pierce. The shadows near William's chair moved with purpose, stretching across the floor and walls, pressing at him like living steel. The mansion had claimed its second prey, and the message was clear: resistance was futile. Edward Linton, still trembling from his earlier ordeal, tried to rise to pull Price free, but the mansion's grip was relentless. The very air seemed to thicken around him, pulling at his muscles and joints, bending his body into a posture of helplessness. He fell back into his chair, eyes darting wildly, understanding for the first time the scale of their doom. Caldwell, standing at the head of the table, remained calm, almost detached. He moved like a conductor guiding a symphony, orchestrating every movement, every terror, every collapse with precise control. "Do you see what it means to be chosen?" he asked softly, his voice echoing with authority. "Every sin, every hidden truth, is accounted for. The table does not lie, and neither does this house. The remaining men felt it in their bones. Their secrets, their pride, their sins, they were all visible now, illuminated by some unseen light. Each heartbeat was measured, each thought catalogued. The mansion consumed not only flesh but essence, and with each guest that fell, it grew stronger, hungrier, more deliberate. The shadows writhed across the walls, crawling over portraits, pooling around feet, snaking toward the chairs. Their shapes hinted at what awaited the others, grotesque and inevitable, a promise of what would come if they did not submit. Thomas Grady realized that survival required more than courage. It required understanding the rules of this nightmare. And yet, even as he searched for leverage, even as he tried to calculate the house's logic, the mansion's pulse quickened, responding to fear, thriving on despair. By the end of the fifth course, the table had claimed half its guests. The remaining men understood. They were living on borrowed time, and every second brought them closer to the abyss Caldwell had prepared. The sixth course arrived with an almost ceremonial precision. Dark, glossy sauces coated meats that glistened under the flickering sea. Candlelight. Each bite was rich, aromatic, and intoxicating. Yet beneath the surface, the meal carried a far darker purpose. It was not nourishment. It was a conduit, a tool designed to break minds and tether them to the mansion's will. Thomas Grady, still trembling from the previous horrors, noticed a subtle shift in perception. The room seemed to pulse in sync with their racing hearts. The shadows, now familiar, moved with intention, curling along the floor, sliding across the walls, always circling, always watching. Every subtle sound, the clink of silverware, the whisper of fire, was amplified, echoing inside their heads, feeding unease into every fiber of their being. Caldwell spoke little, yet his presence dominated every inch of the space. "The mansion knows," he whispered, almost inaudible, yet each man heard it as clearly as his own heartbeat. "It knows your past, your desires, your fears. The more you resist, the deeper it binds you." William Price, who had survived the earlier onslaught, now found himself facing visions. Flickers of the fallen guests appeared in corners of his vision, twisting, whispering truths he had hidden even from himself. He saw himself through their eyes, weak, complicit, and utterly exposed. The mansion did not merely claim the body, it dissected the psyche, leaving the mind raw and vulnerable. Edward Linton felt a compulsion rise within him, an uncontrollable urge to confess sins, to speak truths he had buried for decades. Every hidden transgression, every whispered lie surged into awareness. The mansion's walls seemed to hum, responding to the revelations, drawing strength from the terror it invoked. Caldwell moved like a shadow among shadows, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos around him. He watched the men writhe under psychological siege, guiding the mansion's influence with precision, extracting obedience, testing endurance, measuring fear. By the end of the sixth course, the remaining men were no longer merely terrified, they were transformed. Their minds had been bent, their wills weakened. Each bite of food, each sip of wine, each passing second had been a lesson in submission, a slow unraveling of ego and reason. And as the shadows leaned closer, twisting toward each man, the mansion whispered its eternal truth. Those who enter its walls do not leave unchanged. Their very essence belongs now to the table, to Caldwell, and to the dark, unending hunger of the midnight supper. By the time the sixth course had been partially consumed, Thomas Grady realized that survival was no longer an option. The mansion had shifted from predator to executioner. The shadows had grown bolder, snaking across the floor, curling around legs and arms, reaching into the very chairs to grip flesh with invisible hands. Edward Linton was the first to feel the mansion's full embrace. A tightening sensation gripped his chest, coiling like a serpent. He struggled to draw breath, but the room resisted. Panic clawed at his throat, a choking force that made each inhale impossible. The shadows stretched toward him, stretching his fears into physical form. He reached for Caldwell, pleading silently, but Caldwell's eyes held only detached observation, a conductor watching the final note of his symphony. The mansion's whispers had evolved into voices, distinct, insistent, relentless. You cannot leave. You cannot resist. You are ours. Edward's mind wavered under the assault, memories of guilt, regret, and shame merging with the present terror. Each thought became a weapon against him, slicing his resolve until it was raw and exposed. William Price and the remaining men watched in silent horror, helpless. Every attempt to intervene was met with the mansion's invisible chains. The air itself seemed to constrict, binding muscles and nerves, leaving only fear as their companion. Edward's body twitched and convulsed, the final tremors of a man being claimed not just in body, but in mind and soul. Caldwell's calm presence contrasted sharply with the chaos. "Do you see?" he murmured, the words almost ceremonial. "Each man reveals himself, each weakness is catalogued, and each revelation feeds the table. Your choices brought you here. Your sins prepared you for this moment." Edward's final gasp was silent, absorbed by the mansion. The shadows receded momentarily, leaving only the pall of inevitability. 6 men remained, their minds frayed, their bodies trembling, knowing that the house had tasted their companions and that their turn would come. The table, once a symbol of camaraderie, now appeared as a dark altar. The remaining courses loomed like executioners, each bite a step closer to the grave. And as the firelight flickered across the walls, revealing grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at them, the truth became unavoidable. The midnight supper was a mechanism, precise, deliberate, and absolute. The mansion hungered still, its whispers promising that the remaining 7 would fall in sequence, each course a calculated descent into terror. And in that room, frozen in time and fear, the surviving men understood. Escape was an illusion, and the table would claim them all. The 7th course arrived quietly, with the deceptive elegance of a feast, yet beneath its polished surface lay malevolence. Dark meats, seasoned with spices unknown, rested on plates that seemed to absorb the flickering candlelight, casting long, unnatural shadows across the table. Each dish exuded an aroma that clawed at memory and instinct, coaxing both hunger and dread from the remaining guests. Thomas Grady and William Price exchanged glances, their eyes hollow, understanding without words that the mansion had them firmly in its grasp. Every inhale carried a weight. Every heartbeat amplified the presence of the house itself, as though the walls were veins pumping malice into the room. No corner was safe, no shadow was static. The mansion's hunger was alive, deliberate, sentient. Edward Linton was gone, his absence a gaping wound in the table's rhythm. The empty chair trembled as though still occupied, the echoes of his final convulsions lingering in the air. Caldwell moved among the remaining men, silent yet omnipresent, filling the space with an authority that was both chilling and hypnotic. His eyes flicked to each man in turn, cataloguing fear, measuring resistance, recording the nuances of terror that only he could perceive. The whispers returned, louder, forming coherent syllables now, words that carved into consciousness. Your time is measured. Your mind is open. The house consumes all that you hide. The words were not spoken aloud, yet each guest heard them distinctly, felt them resonate deep within bone and sinew. The mansion did not merely watch. It taught, tormented and reshaped perception, bending reality toward its own grim design. William Price noticed subtle transformations among them. Shadows in mirrors seemed to twist faces slightly, reflecting not what was, but what the mansion deemed inevitable. His own hands appeared pale and elongated, as if the house was drawing him into its own form. Each man began to see their essence mirrored back, distorted, haunted, preparing them for their own collapse. Caldwell's calm remained unbroken. "Do you feel it?" he asked softly. "The table, the house, they are one. They know you, strip you bare, and weigh your worth. Only then do they decide your fate." The remaining guests realized the futility of rebellion. Fear had become a chain, each heartbeat a tightening loop. The mansion thrived on their desperation, feeding on panic, and each course served as another tether to the inevitable. By the seventh course, the table had become more than a meal. It was a trap, a ritual, a machine designed to consume not merely flesh, but the very essence of those who dared to sit. And with the mansion's grip tightening, the remaining men understood the truth. The midnight supper had them utterly and completely, and no amount of courage would alter the outcome. The mansion had grown bold. Its pulse was a living rhythm, pressing into the chests of the remaining men with every heartbeat. The seventh course, though seemingly ordinary, carried a weight that no mortal could endure. Each bite sank like stone in the stomach, yet it was more than physical sustenance. It was a channel through which the house reached into mind and soul. Thomas Grady was the first to falter. A creeping numbness began in his fingers, spreading upward with a deliberate slowness that mocked his attempts at control. The shadows leaned closer, curling around his chair, licking at his skin like liquid darkness. Panic surged, and his voice, when it came, was a broken whisper. No one could hear him outside his own mind, but the mansion listened. Every plea, every thought, every instinct of survival was catalogued, dissected, and folded into the table's growing appetite. William Price watched in helpless horror as Grady convulsed, the room responding in perfect synchrony. Candles flickered violently, reflecting monstrous distortions across the walls. Portraits twisted, their painted faces becoming grotesque echoes of fear. Grady's screams rose in pitch and intensity, yet there was no release, no salvation. Only the mansion, absorbing each sound as fuel, turning terror into ritual. Caldwell observed without a tremor. His hand rested lightly on the table, eyes scanning the room with surgical precision. "Do you see how the house chooses?" he murmured, a teacher explaining a lesson far too late. "Your weaknesses, your hidden truths, are not secrets here, they are chains. They determine who falls and who remains, until the table has been satisfied." The convulsions reached their climax. Grady's body writhed, eyes rolled back, and then, finally, his figure slumped, motionless. The mansion exhaled as though savoring the finality. Silence descended, dense and suffocating, pressing against the remaining men, reminding them that their fates were inexorably tied to the same course. The remaining 5 men felt the weight of inevitability settle upon them. Each one's breath was measured, every heartbeat a countdown. They understood now that the midnight supper was not a meal, nor even a test. It was a harvest, and they were the crop, ready for the house's insatiable hunger. Shadows writhed closer, stretching over chairs, along walls, curling around the firelight, and reaching toward those who remained. The mansion was patient, methodical, precise, and as the flickering glow revealed distorted reflections of the living, it became undeniable. None would leave unmarked, and each passing course would claim another soul, until all 13 lay in the graves silently promised. The 8th course was served with a deliberate elegance, a final display of the mansion's deceptive civility. Rich sauces, roasted game, and pastries that glimmered with an unnatural sheen filled the plates. The men stared, some too terrified to eat, yet each bite was unavoidable, a compulsion they could not resist. The mansion had stripped them of choice. Indulgence was now a tether to doom. William Price's hands shook violently as he lifted the fork. Every movement felt delayed, heavy, as though the air itself had thickened. The shadows along the walls twisted, stretching unnaturally, merging with the flickering candlelight to create monstrous shapes. Reflections in the mirrors warped the remaining men's faces into grotesque caricatures of fear, each grimace emphasizing their helplessness. Thomas Grady's absence weighed on them, a silent testament to the mansion's power. Fear had mutated into clarity. This was not just a house. It was a predator, methodical and ancient, capable of discerning weakness and exploiting it with precision. Each course was a step deeper into inevitability, a dance with a force that observed, measured, and consumed without mercy. Caldwell's movements were imperceptible, yet omnipresent. He poured wine with meticulous care, filled, plates with unerring accuracy, and watched as the men struggled against their internal unraveling. "The mansion does not merely test," he whispered, almost reverently. "It understands. It sees the darkness you bury. It weighs your courage and then determines your end. There is no randomness here." William felt his mind fracture under the pressure. Thoughts, memories, and sins he had long buried rose to the surface in vivid, uncontrollable clarity. He saw himself through the eyes of shadows, twisted into forms that whispered every regret, every betrayal. The mansion drew strength from his unraveling, feeding on fear until it became indistinguishable from reality itself. Every bite, every sip amplified the mansion's hold. The air throbbed, pulsing like a heartbeat that matched the terror within their chests. The shadows coiled closer, creeping over the table, sliding across the floor, and nudging at the men's bodies as if guiding them toward their inevitable collapse. By the end of the 8th course, their sense of self had begun to erode. Names, memories, and reason became hazy, replaced by instinctive fear and helplessness. The mansion had claimed dominance over mind and body alike. And as the firelight flickered, painting monstrous reflections across the walls, the men realized they were no longer participants, they were instruments. Instruments of a ritual older than memory, a process that would leave no survivor untouched. By the time the 8th course had been partially consumed, the mansion's presence was undeniable, its grip absolute. William Price felt the weight of inevitability pressing into him from all sides, a suffocating force that compressed lungs, thoughts, and courage alike. Every shadow seemed alive, curling over the walls, pooling near the chairs, and reaching toward him with an almost tactile menace. Edward Linton's absence and Thomas Grady's demise hung in the air like a suffocating fog. The table had become a ledger of loss, each empty chair a warning, each fallen man a mirror of what awaited the survivors. Fear was no longer mere emotion. It had become a physical presence, wrapping around their throats and pulling them toward the inevitable. William's breath quickened and the whispers returned, more coherent now, threading into his mind with surgical precision. "You cannot escape. You are here by choice and by fault. The table demands its due. The mansion knows your heart and weighs your worth." The words carved themselves into his consciousness, overriding any rational thought, dismantling resistance piece by piece. Caldwell moved with deliberate calm, serving the remaining men like a master of ceremonies overseeing a grim ritual. His eyes flicked to William, noting every twitch, every involuntary shiver, every attempt at composure that failed. He did not touch the man. There was no need. The mansion had already claimed him, and Caldwell's role was one of observation and enforcement, guiding the inevitable conclusion with subtle gestures. William's hands shook violently as he tried to push the plate away, but they were drawn back, compelled by a force stronger than willpower. His mind reeled, memories of failures, betrayals, and sins amplified by the mansion's presence, merging past and present into a singular, torturous reality. He convulsed, the room tilting, shadows twisting over him as though to swallow him whole. And then, finally, his body gave way. He collapsed into the chair, limbs contorted, eyes wide with terror, and the mansion seemed to exhale, savoring its conquest. The remaining 4 men watched in stunned silence, the inevitability of their fate laid bare before them. The table, the mansion, and Caldwell were no longer mere entities. They were one, a living mechanism of judgment feeding on fear, desire, and mortality. The midnight supper had claimed 8, 5 remained. The firelight flickered over distorted reflections on the walls, painting grotesque. painting grotesque images of the surviving men, already rehearsing their own demise in the mansion's relentless calculus. And in that moment, one undeniable truth emerged. Every heartbeat, every tremor, every whispered thought would serve the house until all 13 lay silent. The 9th course arrived with a quiet, almost reverent precision. Plates were placed gently before the 5 remaining men, each dish steaming and glossy, a deceptive invitation to indulgence. The mansion pulsed around them, a living entity, its presence pressing on every nerve, amplifying fear into an almost tangible weight. The air smelled faintly of iron and decay, though no one could locate its source, a subtle reminder that sustenance had always been intertwined with death here. William Price and the others stared at the meal, knowing that every bite would bring them closer to the inevitable. The mansion had stripped them of rational thought. Hunger, temptation, and instinct were now intertwined with terror, forcing them to participate even as the shadows stretched over their hands and feet, crawling toward them like dark tendrils. The whispers returned, forming sentences this time, voices distinct yet impossible to locate. Every action is measured. Every secret is known. Resistance only deepens the embrace. You belong to this house, and the table will see it done. The words carved themselves into consciousness, eroding resolve, breaking down defenses, leaving only primal awareness. Survival was impossible. Only delay existed. Caldwell, ever calm, moved among them with fluid steps. His presence was a study in control, every measured gesture a lesson in domination. "Do you feel it?" he asked softly, his eyes sweeping over the group. "Every choice you've made, every hidden sin, it has brought you to this table. And the table do." Wiz not forget. Thomas Grady, already gone, had been a warning. Edward Linton, a lesson. William could feel the mansion probing his mind, seeking fissures, testing loyalty to life itself. Images of the fallen, faces frozen in terror, flickered in mirrors, in reflections, in shadow shapes that twisted across the walls. The mansion fed on these visions, amplifying the terror, making it impossible to distinguish memory from premonition. As the men lifted utensils, their hands trembled. Each bite was deliberate, involuntary, yet loaded with psychological weight. Every morsel became a tether, binding them to the mansion's rhythm, aligning their bodies and minds with its intent. Fear and hunger fused, creating a trance-like state, a slow descent into inevitability. By the end of the 9th course, the mansion had not only claimed 2/3 of its guests, it had begun reshaping the remaining 5, bending their will, breaking resistance, and preying on the psyche. Shadows twisted tighter, the firelight danced more erratically, and whispers became a constant pulse in every mind. The midnight supper was no longer merely a table or a meal. It was a force, calculating, deliberate, and absolute, and the remaining men understood the slow descent into the mansion's dominion had only just begun. The 9th course had barely settled in their stomachs when the mansion struck again. The shadows moved with precision, creeping over the remaining guests' chairs, lacing around their limbs like living chains. The air grew heavy, each breath a struggle, each heartbeat a drum counting down the seconds of their inevitability. William Price was the first to falter. A sudden chill raced through his veins, followed by a twisting pressure in his chest. His vision blurred, and the walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with his racing heart. Whispers intensified, voices threading into his mind, repeating plans, failures, and fears in a relentless, haunting cadence. He fell to his knees, clutching at the air, trying to fight an invisible force that was not only physical but psychological, bending his consciousness toward surrender. Caldwell remained an unwavering figure at the head of the table, calm and composed. His gaze swept over the men like a predator observing prey in the final stages of capture. Every secret surfaces, every fear manifests. Resistance only fuels the inevitable, he intoned, his voice low but cutting through the mansion's oppressive hum. The mansion listened, responded, and amplified his authority, each syllable a hammer against the remaining men's fragile resolve. The mansion itself seemed to pulse with delight at William's struggle, shadows writhing and crawling across the walls, pooling at his feet, and curling over the remaining guests' chairs in warning. The whispers became coherent, almost sentient, embedding images of the fallen, twisted expressions of agony, frozen hands reaching out, silent screams echoing in mind and bone. William's body convulsed violently, every muscle betraying him as if the mansion had commandeered his nervous system. His eyes rolled back and the final silent scream slipped from his lips. The table had claimed him, not merely as flesh, but as an essence, his very presence absorbed into the house's dark design. The remaining 4 men froze, understanding with stark clarity that the mansion's influence was absolute. The ritual was precise, methodical, and unstoppable. The table was more than a surface with food. It was a mechanism, a deliberate instrument of fear and consumption, bending reality and willpower alike. Shadows stretched, reflecting the grotesque forms of the remaining men in the firelight. The mansion exhaled around them, a predator savoring the inevitability of its remaining prey. And in that chilling moment, the survivors knew with certainty the midnight supper would not end until all 13 had fallen, and no mercy, no courage, and no escape would alter its purpose. The 10th course arrived with an eerie elegance, each plate placed with surgical precision. The aroma was intoxicating, yet it carried an undercurrent of decay, a subtle whisper of what had been consumed before. The remaining 4 men stared in hollow fascination, their appetites overridden by terror. The mansion no longer merely observed. They could feel it pressing into them, probing, bending, dissecting their minds with relentless intent. Caldwell moved along the table like a shadow incarnate, pouring wine into trembling hands, adjusting plates with uncanny exactness. He did not need to speak. The mansion amplified his presence, weaving his authority into the shadows themselves. "Do you feel it?" he whispered softly. "Every choice, every hidden truth, every secret sin. It has all led to this moment. And the mansion remembers." The men's minds fractured under the weight of anticipation. Whispers, once subtle, now formed coherent threats, insinuations and confessions they had never voiced aloud. The mansion drew power from their fear, and the more they tried to resist, the more it penetrated their consciousness. Each shadow along the walls seemed to curl inward, stretching toward them, wrapping the room in a living web of psychological torment. Thomas Grady, Edward Linton, and William Price were gone. Their absence hung in the air like a suffocating fog, and the remaining 4 felt the table itself throb beneath their fingers, as though each plate was a heart beating in time with the mansion's dark rhythm. Each bite of the 10th course forced the men deeper into the mansion's dominion. Hunger and fear merged into a single compulsion. Resisting was impossible. The mansion had perfected its mechanism: consume, submit, unravel. Reflections in the mirrors twisted, showing distorted images of themselves. Shadows lengthened and coiled like serpents and wisping, as fed on memories, turning past transgressions into instruments of despair. The firelight flickered violently, revealing shapes that were both familiar and monstrous. Faces of the fallen glimmered in the shadows, their silent screams etched into walls, mirrors, and minds. The mansion was a predator, and the table a trap from which there was no reprieve. By the end of the 10th course, the remaining men had begun to unravel not just in body, but in mind. Their sense of self, their courage, pride, and reason was being systematically stripped away. The mansion had claimed dominance over every thought, every instinct, and every heartbeat, preparing to deliver the next act of inevitability. By the time the 10th course had been partially consumed, the mansion's dominance was absolute. Shadows slithered along the walls like sentient creatures, stretching their dark fingers toward the remaining men. Every heartbeat, every trembling breath was a drumbeat announcing the inevitability of the next conquest. William Price's mind began to fracture entirely. Thoughts collided with memories, fears, and guilt, spinning into a vortex of paralyzing dread. The mansion had woven itself into his consciousness, distorting reality so that even the room itself seemed alive, observing, judging, and tormenting him. Every flicker of candlelight became a moving eye, every reflection a mocking doppelganger. Caldwell observed silently, his presence amplified by the mansion's influence. "Do you understand now?" he whispered, almost rhetorically, as though explaining a lesson that could never be comprehended fully. This table does not merely feed. It examines, it weighs, it harvests the very essence of each man, and it has chosen you. William's hands shook violently as he reached for the plate. The food seemed to pulse beneath his fingers, a rhythm in sync with the mansion's dark heartbeat. The shadows moved closer, curling over the table, brushing against skin, pressing into minds. Panic surged. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive weight of the house. His body convulsed as the mansion's grip tightened. Whispers now took form, voices of the fallen, Grady, Linton and the others, coalescing into a chorus of silent condemnation. Images of their twisted faces, locked in eternal terror, flashed across mirrors, walls and firelight, a relentless reminder of the fate that awaited him. Finally, the convulsions ceased. William's body slumped forward, lifeless, and the mansion seemed to exhale, savoring the completion of its calculated design. The remaining 3 men froze in terror, understanding that their survival was no longer a question of courage, but of how long they could delay the inevitable. The table had claimed 10. The mansion's hunger was methodical, precise, and unrelenting. Each guest had been stripped of control, consumed not just in body but in mind and spirit. The midnight supper was no longer a secret. It was a force beyond comprehension, a predator that had already harvested the majority of its prey. Shadows writhed across the remaining men, mirrors distorted their reflections, and whispers threaded into thoughts. The mansion was patient, deliberate, and unstoppable, and the survivors knew with chilling clarity there was no escape, only submission, and the table would claim them all in turn. The 11th course arrived with a quiet precision, each plate laid before the 3 remaining men like a challenge. The aroma was intoxicating, carrying a strange mixture of spices and decay, a scent that tugged at the mind as much as the stomach. The mansion pulsed around them, an invisible heartbeat that reverberated through every nerve and muscle. Henry Caldwell's calm remained unnerving, almost godlike. He moved among the men with ease, adjusting silverware, offering wine with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "The mansion sees more than your body," he whispered softly. "It sees your essence, your fears, your deepest truths. Every course peels away what you hide from yourself." The remaining men, James Harlow, Samuel Brooks and Philip Turner, felt their minds begin to fracture. The mansion's influence penetrated the synapses, bending thought, twisting memory, and amplifying every sense. Shadows along the walls became serpentine, moving with deliberate intent, crawling across the floor to encircle their legs. Reflections in the mirrors twisted, elongating faces into grotesque parodies, mouths screaming without sound. The whispers returned louder, more coherent, threading into consciousness. "The house knows. It knows who you are. Resistance is a lie. Submission is inevitable. You are already counted." Every word struck like a chisel, carving fear into the very marrow of their bones. James Harlow was the first to falter. He lifted his fork with trembling hands, compelled by forces beyond comprehension. Each bite seemed to weigh on his soul, and his mind spiraled into memories he could no longer distinguish from hallucination. Every sin, every failure, every fear he had buried resurfaced in vivid clarity. The mansion's dominance was total. It did not merely observe, it manipulated, dissected, and reshaped perception itself. Candles flickered violently, casting shadows that appeared to reach for the men, pressing into flesh and mind. Firelight danced on walls that seemed to breathe with life, pulsating in rhythm with the terror coursing through their veins. By the end of the 11th course, the edge of madness had become tangible. The men were no longer individuals. They were instruments of the mansion's design, each heartbeat, each tremor, each involuntary breath feeding the dark ritual. Hunger and fear had fused, bending them into submission. The table had begun its final work, and the mansion's patient grip tightened with cruel inevitability. The remaining 3 men understood, without words, that the table had claimed 10, and soon the 11th would fall. The midnight supper's shadow stretched longer, darker, and hung heavy over the room. The 11th course had barely settled when the mansion delivered its verdict. Shadows had grown dense, crawling over the walls, pooling near the chairs, whispering in a chorus of the damned. Every sound in the room, the crackle of fire, the faint rustle of silverware, was amplified, twisting into a cacophony that shredded reason and sanity. James Harlowe's hands shook violently. The mansion's presence pressed into him, a living force that constricted lungs and warped perception. He could see the faces of the fallen in every reflective surface, the twisted, silent screams of those who had come before him. The table's purpose was clear now. Each course was a harvest, each bite a step toward annihilation. Resistance was futile. Caldwell's gaze swept the room, calm and omnipotent, as if he were conducting a symphony of terror. "Do you feel it?" he murmured. "The house has already chosen. Every heartbeat, every thought, every sin, mapped and weighed. The table claims what it desires." His voice was soft but unstoppable, echoed by the mansion itself, pressing deeper into Harlowe's mind. Harlowe tried to speak, to call out, but the words failed him. Fear had become physical, a tight coil of muscle and bone, binding him to inevitability. His body convulsed violently as images of his sins, real and imagined, swirled in his mind like a storm. The mansion drank in the chaos, feeding on every tremor, every scream, every shred of terror. The shadows stretched further, coiling around Harlowe's chair, wrapping his limbs in darkness, blurring the line between flesh and shadow. The remaining two men, Samuel Brooks and Philip Turner, watched, frozen, as the mansion consumed its guest, bending him into the rhythm of the midnight supper. Finally, Harlowe collapsed. Limbs twisted unnaturally, eyes wide and unseeing, his breath shallow and erratic before ceasing entirely. The mansion exhaled, a subtle, almost imperceptible shiver through the floorboards and walls, a silent affirmation that the table had taken another. 10 were gone. 2 remained. The remaining men felt the mansion's intent pressing upon them like a living thing. Their minds began to unravel, each heartbeat a drumbeat, counting down the seconds until they too would fall. The firelight flickered violently. Shadows danced grotesquely on the walls, and whispers threaded through their thoughts, repeating a single truth. The table claimed all, and the mansion was patient, unrelenting, unstoppable. At this point, the ritual had reached a crescendo. The final courses awaited, and with them, the final acts of inevitability. The midnight supper was no longer a story. It was a force, and it had claimed the 11th soul. The 12th course was placed before the last 2 men with a ceremonial precision that made the mansion itself seem to breathe. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of roasted meat, earthy roots, and something faintly metallic, blood or memory of it. The remaining diners, Samuel Brooks and Philip Turner, stared at their plates, knowing with every fiber of their being that each bite brought them closer to an end they could not escape. The mansion had stripped them of rational thought. Fear had fused with instinct, desire with horror, and survival had become a compulsion that only the house controlled. Shadows twisted along the walls, flickering in the firelight, stretching and coiling like serpents, their forms impossible to separate from imagination. Reflections in mirrors were grotesque, faces elongated, eyes hollowed, mouths twisted in silent screams that mirrored the empty chairs of the fallen. Caldwell moved between them, slow and deliberate, his hands precise, his voice low and commanding. "This is no ordinary meal," he whispered. "Each course has stripped away the illusions you call free will. The mansion knows you, sees you, weighs you. Resistance is meaningless. Submission is inevitable." Samuel's hands trembled violently as he lifted the fork, his mind fraying under the mansion's omnipresent gaze. Memories, long buried, erupted in vivid clarity, failures, betrayals, secret sins, and moments of cowardice he had tried to forget. The whispers grew louder, more coherent, threading through thought and memory with surgical precision. The mansion remembers. It demands its due. Every thought, every regret, every heartbeat is counted. Philip Turner felt his perception bending, reality twisting around him. Shadows stretched across the floor, snaking toward him, merging with his own legs, pressing into the mind and body, merging observer with observed. Hunger and terror collided, creating a compulsion beyond reason. Eat, survive, submit. By the time the 12th course was half consumed, the mansion had claimed dominance over every instinct, every rational thought, every shred of autonomy. Samuel's mind cracked entirely, and Philip felt the shadows press tighter, a weight that bent him to the mansion's will. The table had become more than a surface with food. It was a mechanism of control, of fear, and of inevitable death. The mansion pulsed around them, alive, deliberate, patient, a predator savoring the approach of its final harvest. By the end of the 12th course, the last two men understood one undeniable truth. Their minds had been broken long before the table would claim their bodies. The 12th course had barely settled when the mansion's grip tightened like a vice. Samuel Brooks was the first to falter. His hands shook uncontrollably, the fork slipping from his grasp as his vision blurred. Shadows snaked along the walls, pooling beneath his chair, wrapping around his limbs, pressing in a suffocating embrace that was neither physical nor imagined. It was both, and far worse. Whispers filled his mind, now a coherent chorus of condemnation and inevitability. You can not escape. Every sin, every secret, every heartbeat has brought you here. The table demands its due, and it will not be denied. Images of the fallen, twisted faces frozen in terror, flickered across mirrors and firelight as if mocking him, confirming the absolute dominance of the mansion and its malevolent host. Caldwell observed silently, the embodiment of calm authority, the conductor of this horrifying symphony. The mansion sees all, he intoned softly, eyes sweeping the remaining guests. It has claimed 10. It is patient, deliberate, unstoppable, and now it claims you. Samuel convulsed violently, every muscle betraying him, as the mansion's force penetrated his mind and body. Memories, real and imagined, collided with the present, the failures, the betrayals, the moments of hidden shame, and twisted them into a suffocating nightmare. Each breath felt like inhaling fire. Each heartbeat became a hammer striking against the fragile shell of his sanity. Philip Turner watched in silent horror, understanding that his own fate was imminent. The mansion's shadows writhed and coiled around Samuel's chair, merging with the man, bending him into submission. Finally, Samuel's body went limp. Eyes wide and unseeing, he slumped forward onto the table, consumed not only in flesh but in essence. The mansion exhaled, subtle yet absolute, as if acknowledging the completion of its calculation. Philip Turner, alone now, felt the mansion's full presence press into him. The table had claimed 12. Shadows danced grotesquely across walls and mirrors, whispering secrets and warnings, a relentless reminder of the inevitability that awaited him. Every heartbeat, every shiver, every involuntary thought had been measured, calculated, and manipulated to perfection. The midnight supper had stripped all but one guest of life and reason. The mansion's dominion was complete, absolute, and patient, preparing for the final harvest. Philip understood that resistance was a lie. The mansion was not merely a place, a house, or a table. It was a force beyond comprehension, a predator that had claimed 12 of 13. Philip Turner sat alone before the final plate, his hands trembling, sweat dripping down his temples. The mansion loomed around him, a living entity whose pulse reverberated through the floorboards and walls. Every shadow flickered and twisted in the firelight, morphing into grotesque reflections of the 12 men who had come before him, faces frozen in silent screams, eyes wide in eternal terror. Caldwell moved behind him with deliberate, predator-like precision. "Do you feel it?" he asked, a whisper that penetrated the very marrow of Philip's bones. "This is not just a meal. This is a reckoning. Every choice, every secret, every heartbeat has led you here, and the mansion claims all." The final course was exquisite in appearance, rich meats, glistening sauces, and a bouquet of aromas that were almost intoxicating. Yet beneath the surface was the unmistakable scent of decay, a subtle reminder of what had been consumed, what had been lost. Philip knew that to eat was to seal his fate, yet to resist was to defy the mansion's will, an impossibility he understood too late. Whispers swirled through his mind, coherent now, relentless. You cannot escape. You are the last. Your fears, your memories, your sins, everything belongs to the house. Every bite brings you closer to what has been waiting since the first guest arrived. The mansion pressed against his consciousness, warping perception, bending his mind into a state of pure terror. Philip's hands shook as he lifted the fork, his body betraying him even as his mind screamed for resistance. The shadows stretched closer, curling over his chair, merging with him, pressing into flesh and bone. Every sensory input, sound, sight, touch, was amplified into an overwhelming assault, breaking down his ability to reason, to to survive. Caldwell's presence seemed everywhere at once, a ghostly authority amplified by the mansion. The table will not forgive. The mansion will not relent. And you are the final piece. Philip took a bite. It was instant. His vision fragmented, his mind collapsing under the mansion's unyielding pressure. Memories collided with hallucinations, and fear became a living, writhing thing inside him. Every heartbeat was a drum counting down his final moments, every breath a tether drawing him inexorably into the mansion's dominion. By the end of the final course, the 13th guest had been claimed. The mansion exhaled, a subtle shiver running through walls, mirrors, and floorboards, confirming that the midnight supper was complete. 13 guests, 13 graves, not a single soul remained untouched, unbroken, or unconsumed. With the last guest consumed, the mansion fell into a deceptive silence. There was no celebration, no release, only the oppressive awareness of power fully exercised. The shadows had retreated slightly, yet the atmosphere remained suffocating, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the terror and now exhaled it slowly, deliberately, over the empty table. Caldwell stood at the head of the table, his figure perfectly still, a silent sentinel over the carnage. His eyes swept over the plates, now untouched and cold, and the chairs now vacant but heavy with memory. "The table is complete," he whispered, voice low but carrying through the silent halls. "Every will has been tested, every soul weighed, every fear harvested." The mansion itself seemed to pulse with satisfaction, breathing in a rhythm that resonated through the floorboards and the ceiling beams. The flicker of firelight cast grotesque shadows that writhed like snakes, coiling over walls, mirrors, and even the floor. They were reminders, warnings, and a proof of dominion. This house was not merely a place, but an instrument of control, an entity capable of bending body and mind alike. Outside, the night was still. The wind whispered through broken trees, carrying with it echoes of the screams that had been consumed and the silent lessons left behind. To the world, the mansion was quiet, abandoned perhaps, but inside, the traces of the 13 guests remained imprinted in the very structure, their terror, their surrender, their essence, all part of the mansion's unholy architecture. The chairs still bore the impressions of the fallen, the table the residue of feasts that were more than meals, and the mirrors reflected not the room, but the twisted echoes of lives undone. The mansion had transformed from a building into a vessel, a container of dark knowledge and forbidden truths, a testament to the consequences of curiosity and the irresistible pull of the unknown. Caldwell moved slowly through the halls, touching walls, whispering names of the consumed, reaffirming their place within the house. "They are gone," he murmured, "yet they remain. Their essence fuels the purpose. The mansion does not forgive. It does not forget. And it waits for the next." The midnight supper had ended, but the mansion's dominion endured. Every shadow, every whisper, every silent reflection was a reminder that control had been absolute, and the lessons of submission were etched into the very fabric of the walls. For those who would dare enter in the future, the mansion's message was clear. Nothing escapes its reach, and every guest would eventually learn what the 13 before had already discovered. Even after the final course had claimed its victims, the mansion held a secret deeper than any table, any shadows, any whispers. It was a truth deliberately concealed, buried beneath layers of fear, ritual and calculation, a truth so dangerous that even Caldwell's careful orchestration could barely contain it. Philip Turner's essence, though consumed, had left traces, remnants in two. He mirrors walls and furniture. The mansion was alive and it remembered. Each guest had contributed a fragment of themselves, a piece of fear, of desire, of surrender. But there was more. A pattern hidden within the sequence of courses, a method to the madness that few could comprehend. The mansion was not random, it was deliberate in ways that reached beyond mere killing, beyond terror, beyond psychological dominion. Caldwell traced his fingers along the table, the grooves etched by knives and forks of those who had fallen, and murmured. The guests believe themselves alone, but the mansion sees everything. It feeds not only on life, but on understanding, on the collapse of control, on the unspoken compulsion to witness and obey. And it teaches those who remain how fragile reality truly is. The mirrors reflected more than the mansion's interior. They reflected the consequences of human curiosity, the inevitability of surrender to a power greater than comprehension. Each shadow on the walls was a cipher, each flicker of candlelight a symbol. Only those who understood the mansion's design could decode it, and even then the knowledge came at a cost. Outside, the night stretched endless and indifferent. Wind carried faint echoes of the screams, but only those attuned to the mansion's rhythm could discern their message. The house had claimed 13 souls, but it had left a lesson for the world. Every step toward forbidden knowledge carries a price, and even the most meticulous observer is prey when curiosity and fear intersect. Caldwell paused in the center of the grand hall, shadows stretching toward him like servants of dark intent. "The mansion waits," he whispered, "and the table remembers. One day another will arrive, another will take the seat of the curious, the greedy, the brave, or the foolish, and they will learn what it means to dine at the midnight supper." The mansion had consumed its guests, but its secret endured, an eternal silent testament to the intertwining of fear, knowledge, and control. And for those who dared approach, the message was clear: to enter was to submit, and to submit was to lose more than life itself. When the world eventually discovered the mansion, the truth had already been buried beneath layers of legend, half-whispered tales, and fearful silence. Local authorities arrived weeks later, guided by a lone wanderer who had glimpsed the house in the dark. Yet none could comprehend the scope of what had occurred. The mansion's halls were empty, the table cold, yet every room bore the invisible weight of 13 lives claimed, 13 minds shattered, 13 souls integrated into the very architecture. Newspapers attempted to recount the events, but their words were feeble, incapable of capturing the psychological precision and supernatural dominion that had unfolded. The story was dismissed as rumor, a grotesque exaggeration of miners' superstitions and late-night fireside tales. Yet the whispers persisted among those who dared linger near the mansion's shadow, a terror passed orally, coded into warnings, half-remembered in trembling recollections. Caldwell vanished from the records entirely. There was no trial, no arrest, no explanation. He became a phantom figure, simultaneously mythic and horrifyingly real, a man who orchestrated a banquet that transcended mere murder. The mansion itself became his legacy, a living testament to control, ritual, and the absolute corruption of curiosity. Those few who had survived near the property, miners, travelers, and wandering adventurers, spoke in muted tones of sensations that defied logic, whispers in empty halls, shadows that moved with intent, the weight of unseen eyes upon them, compelling them to obey or flee. Scholars who later examined the site noted subtle anomalies, furniture slightly displaced as if occupied, mirrors reflecting things unseen, and traces of twelity. The heart's rhythm still detectable in the floorboards. The mansion was never destroyed. Attempts to burn it failed inexplicably. Storms collapsed parts of the roof, yet it endured. Its presence became a quiet terror, embedded in the collective memory of the region. Families warned children to avoid the area, travelers kept distance, and miners whispered tales of the midnight supper, only in darkness, never allowed. To this day, historians and seekers of forbidden knowledge debate the events. Some claim it was a psychological experiment, others insist the mansion possessed a sentient malevolence. Yet the pattern is undeniable. 13 guests entered, 13 graves marked, 13 lives consumed by a force beyond comprehension. The mansion endures, silent yet alive, a haunting reminder of the cost of curiosity and the inescapable power of domination when ancient secrets and human weakness collide. The mansion still stands, a relic of horror and forbidden mastery, its windows dark eyes staring into the void, observing the world without interference, yet never forgetting. Those who approach feel its weight before they see it, the oppressive certainty that a mind alone can never fully comprehend its power. Even now, decades later, its walls retain the echoes of 13 lives consumed, their terror woven into the very timber and stone. Caldwell's name survives only as a whisper, a cautionary symbol in the shadowed annals of history. His purpose was clear, to demonstrate the absolute dominion of fear, the systematic unraveling of will, the art of bending mind and body until nothing remains but compliance. The mansion, his instrument, continues to teach the same lessons silently to those who dare approach, those who seek the forbidden. Visitors, rare and often reckless, report sensations impossible to describe, footsteps that match their own, whispers that articulate their deepest fears, mirrors that reflect not themselves but shadows of the consumed. Every sensation is deliberate, a test, a revelation. The mansion does not merely punish curiosity, it educates through submission, proving the cost of seeking knowledge too dangerous to hold. To remember the midnight supper is to acknowledge the fragile nature of freedom, the vulnerability of the mind when confronted with a force that sees all and bends all. The 13 guests are gone, yet in each echo, each shadow, each flicker of candlelight they remain. Their fate is a lesson carved into the essence of the mansion itself. Defiance is impossible, resistance futile, survival a fleeting illusion. The mansion waits. It waits for the next soul whose curiosity outweighs caution, whose arrogance believes they can witness and emerge unscathed. And for you, who listens now, who peers into this story with fascination and dread, understand this truth. Knowledge of the midnight supper changes you. Once you have imagined the mansion, the table, the 13 graves, your mind cannot return to innocence. If you feel its presence in your thoughts tonight, if the shadows in your room seem too deep, if your heartbeat echoes in patterns you cannot explain, know that you have touched what few ever do. The mansion does not forgive. The mansion does not forget. And one day, if you seek it, you may be called to the table yourself. The midnight supper is over. The mansion endures. The lesson remains. And the question lingers, whispered through shadow and silence. When the house comes for you, will you understand the true cost of curiosity, or will you become the next plate at the table?